We thought about places that we would want Meg to attend for college. There are three things primarily that we thought would be most beneficial for her. The first is a solid education that's built on the foundation of God's Word. One of the most valuable parts of the boys' college education is the faculty. For them, it's not just a job, it's not just a lecture that they want to deliver, but they want to have an impact and a discipling relationship with the students. A peer group of friends is wonderful, but also to be discipled and to be invested in by the faculty and by the staff here at Boys is a great gift. The second was a community of people that are genuinely pursuing Christ, that God could use in her life to be able to help show what a genuine, growing walk with Christ is. My wife came with Meg to a preview day when Meg was a senior in high school, and it didn't take very long at all for them to be captivated by the community. The people were genuine, they were friendly, they were eager to be able to share their experience and their love of Boys. And it wasn't long after they arrived at campus that they determined this was going to be the place that Meg wanted to attend. And the third thing is, since college is only a few short years of life, I wanted a college that would emphasize the importance of the local church. And so college is great, the community of people is wonderful, but it's for a short time. And so the importance of the local church, emphasizing it, encouraging students to be involved, recognizing how critical that is for the rest of her life, that was really important. So in addition to those priorities, the reality is that it had to be affordable as well. And college education is expensive, so we really appreciate the fact that Boyce was less expensive than some of the other options that we considered. Many parents are concerned about what type of return on investment they'll see from a college education. And I think that's an important question, but I think it's not just the education, absolutely essential though it may be, but it's also the transformation that's going to take place in the life of their student. If a parent asked me, should I send my son or daughter to Boyce? My answer would be absolutely yes. It's been 2 years since she's been here and she has flourished in many ways. I see her growing in her walk with the Lord. I see her growing in godly friendships, understanding and appreciating the importance of the local church, and developing a better sense of how God wants to use her after her time at Boyce. And we are just so thankful for all of those things.
Growing up in a Christian family, I've heard what Christianity is about from my parents and from my friends, but it wasn't until senior in high school where my youth pastor kept preaching the gospel week in and week out. He taught from the pulpit who God is, who Jesus is, what the scripture is, and in a place of LA where truth is very relative for non-Christians and Christians, I knew that Southern was a great place to come and get solid biblical training where we find truth in the scriptures. We find truth of who God is and what Jesus has done for us and what the scripture can do in a believer's life. And ultimately, I want to do for the people of LA what my youth pastor did for me when I was a new believer, is to proclaim and preach the truth of Jesus Christ.
When I was doing my MDiv at Southern, Dr. Mohler taught a class called The Ministry of Leadership, and the final for that class was a simple question. Imagine this, that you're the pastor at a downtown First Baptist church that's been in decline for decades, and you're at your first deacons meeting. What they've asked you to do is give them a vision and a plan for how to revitalize this church, how to see the Lord breathe life back into this congregation. What's your answer? 6 months later, I was sitting in that very deacons meeting, giving a vision to our church about how we could reverse the decline that we had experienced. And the answer to that is simple. And it's an answer now 7 years later that we still have, that we're still committed to, and it's this. Our commitment was not to try to grow fast. Our commitment was not to try to become the most relevant church in town. Our job was not to try to be the best church in town even. Our goal and our job, we recognized, was to be committed to the truth. And we asked the Lord, if we commit to be a healthy church, would you bless our efforts to be healthy, to be committed to your word? And in everything we do at First Baptist Church, our goal is to be undergirded by the truth.
Several years ago, my friend who went through a very hard divorce came to me for counsel. Well, I told her I'm single, but I could be confident because I had the Word of God. And I see the Word of God did change her life. However, there are some cases that were really hard, and I realized I needed more training. So I decided I went to Southern for biblical counseling. And Southern has equipped me so much to be a very competent counselor. After graduation, I had the privilege working with a nonprofit organization called Recenter Ministries, where we do work with the hurting and the struggling. And all the truth of the scripture I learned at Southern has helped me so much with my ministry. And I hope to continue to see this even wherever God placed me, whether in my family, in my community, back in my country, or wherever I am right now in the States.
So 5 years ago, while I was a student at Southern, God gave us this crazy dream that He birthed in our hearts to go and plant this new gospel-centered church in the heart of downtown Denver. Fast forward 5 years, and by God's grace and God's power, this wild dream has become a reality. Going into the city, you're surrounded all of a sudden by people who don't understand the truth of the gospel, who aren't interested in reading God's word for themselves. And it's been so incredible that as we've been faithful neighbors and faithful witnesses and loved people over the long haul, all of a sudden these people have become open to reading God's word for the first time. Understanding the truth of God's word, understanding the truth of the gospel has been foundational to everything that we've always desired to see happen here in the city. And our hope is that we're building something that will leave a legacy for the glory of Jesus and the good of the city for the long haul.
Growing up in a Christian family, I've heard what Christianity is about from my parents and from my friends, but it wasn't until senior in high school where my youth pastor kept preaching the gospel week in and week out. He taught from the pulpit who God is, who Jesus is, what the scripture is, and in a place of LA where truth is very relative for non-Christians and Christians, I knew that Southern was a great place to come and get solid biblical training where we find truth in the scriptures. We find truth of who God is and what Jesus has done for us and what the scripture can do in a believer's life. And ultimately, I want to do for the people of LA what my youth pastor did for me when I was a new believer, is to proclaim and preach the truth of Jesus Christ.
When I was doing my MDiv at Southern, Dr. Mohler taught a class called the Ministry of Leadership, and the final for that class was a simple question. Imagine this, that you're the pastor at a downtown First Baptist church that's been in decline for decades, and you're at your first deacons meeting. What they've asked you to do is give them a vision and a plan for how to revitalize this church, how to see the Lord breathe life back into this congregation. What's your answer? 6 months later, I was sitting in that very deacons meeting, giving a vision to our church about how we could reverse the decline that we had experienced. And the answer to that is simple, and it's an answer now 7 years later that we still have, that we're still committed to, and it's this. Our commitment was not to try to grow fast. Our commitment was not to try to become the most relevant church in town. Our job was not to try to be the best church in town even. Our goal and our job, we recognized, was to be committed to the truth. And we asked the Lord, if we commit to be a healthy church, would you bless our efforts to be healthy, to be committed to your word? And in everything we do at First Baptist Church, our goal is to be undergirded by the truth.
When we thought about places that we would want Meg to attend for college, there are three things primarily that we thought would be most beneficial for her. The first is a solid education that's built on the foundation of God's Word. One of the most valuable parts of the boys' college education is the faculty. For them, it's not just a job, it's not just a lecture that they want to deliver, but they want to have an impact and a discipling relationship with the students. A peer group of friends is wonderful, but also to be discipled and to be invested in by the faculty and by the staff here at Boyce is a great gift. The second was a community of people that are genuinely pursuing Christ, that God could use in her life to be able to help show what a genuine, growing walk with Christ is. My wife came with...
Good afternoon and welcome to the Leadership Briefing. We're grateful that you could join us today.
It didn't take very long at all for them to be captivated by the community. The people were genuine, they were friendly, they were eager to be able to share their experience and their love of Boyce. And it wasn't long after they arrived at campus that they determined this was going to be the place that Meg wanted to attend. And the third thing is, since college is only a few short years of life, I wanted a college that would emphasize the importance of the local church. And so college is great, and the community of people is wonderful, but it's for a short time. And so the importance of the local church, emphasizing it, encouraging students to be involved, recognizing how critical that is for the rest of her life, that was really important. So in addition to those priorities, the reality is that it had to be affordable as well. And college education is expensive, so we really appreciate the fact that Boyce was less expensive than some of the other options that we considered. Many parents are concerned about what type of return on investment they'll see from a college education. And I think that's an important question, but I think it's not just the education, absolutely essential though it may be, but it's also the transformation that's going to take place in the life of their student. If a parent asked me, should I send my son or daughter to Boyce? My answer would be absolutely yes. It's been 2 years since she's been here and she has flourished in many ways. I see her growing in her walk with the Lord. I see her growing in godly friendships, understanding and appreciating the importance of the local church, and developing a better sense of how God wants to use her after her time at Boyce. And we are just so thankful for all of those things.
Leadership Briefing. We're grateful that you could join us today. When we started the Leadership Briefing a number of years ago, it was our hope that we could introduce leaders in our local community to Southern Seminary and Boyce College and to speak to issues that were important to them. We learned very quickly that leaders in Louisville enjoyed the format of the program and they enjoyed the content, and attendance steadily grew at the events. Then it became our hope that we could find a way to provide the Leadership Briefing content to friends who lived outside of our city limits. Who could have imagined that a pandemic, in combination with the miracle of modern technology, would have enabled us to gather guests from around the country today for a leadership briefing? So I'm extremely happy to be able to greet each of you who is attending the leadership briefing for the first time today. We hope that you're going to enjoy your visit. Now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, the President of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Dr. Albert Mohler. Dr. Mohler became president of the seminary in 1993. Every time I quote that date, it makes me feel exceedingly old because we realize some of our guests were not yet born at the time Dr. Mohler was inaugurated. Something else we know is that 27 years of consistent, successful leadership in a prominent position has more than qualified Dr. Mohler to talk about the topic of leadership. He's drawing from a deep reservoir of experience that few leaders possess. Under Dr. Mohler's leadership, enrollment at Southern Seminary has more than tripled. There were fewer than 1,800 students when he arrived in 1993. Today, the number enrolled is over 5,500 and still growing. A statistic that I find to be even more remarkable is that the students come from more than 60 nations around the world. That's the kind of recruiting success that any college football or basketball coach would envy. During Dr. Mohler's presidency, more than 12,000 students have earned their degrees. Today, those alumni are faithfully preaching God's Word and leading churches all across America and engaged in missions work all around the globe. There is so much more I could tell you about Dr. Mohler and his accomplishments, but I'm already taking away from his speaking time. So I'm going to sit down. You enjoy the leadership lecture and the question and answer session that will follow, but don't tune out too soon. I will be back later with some gifts to give to you. So enjoy the lecture.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership Briefing. I have always enjoyed the opportunity of these events to look at a significant leader from the past and do our best to learn for the present. Today I'm going to be talking about always a general, Dwight D. Eisenhower in war and in peace. Eisenhower is something of an enigma to most Americans, and it's interesting that he has receded into the background of the awareness of so many of those who are living today. But he raises in his leadership, both in the military and in politics, he raises some of the most basic questions about leadership. Is it an art or a science? I think Eisenhower, like most great leaders, would demonstrate it as both. Are leaders born or made? And again, I think Eisenhower demonstrates that to some extent the answer is yes, they are both born and made. But Eisenhower is one of those leaders who helps us to understand, perhaps more than any other, that leadership is learned. And this may be the greatest contribution of the leadership model of Dwight David Eisenhower. He was a leader who learned. He had vast opportunities to learn, far more expansive than most human beings would ever expect to appreciate or to enjoy. Eisenhower, as it turned out, made the most of them. But in order to understand him, we have to put him in the context of his times. And I guess a part of my interest here is that Dwight David Eisenhower's time overlaps with my own. I am one of the last of the Eisenhower babies. I was born in October of 1959. So about the last 14 months of the Eisenhower administration were the first 14 months of my life. And, well, I remember them about as well. I have no personal memory other than the fact that I can't know who I am. The Eisenhower era of the 1950s. And even as I look at my own pictures there in the beginning, those black and white images, I see the black and white images of Dwight Eisenhower, one of the last classic black and white photograph leaders of American history. from John F. Kennedy onward, the photographs would be far more in color. But again, that helps us to understand the times of President Eisenhower. And we are talking about the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe. We are talking about General of the Army, 5-star General Dwight David Eisenhower. We're talking about the 34th President of the United States. But in my mind, Eisenhower's fascinating as a study in leadership because he presents to us two massive questions, and uniquely so. The first is this: how did Dwight Eisenhower come to dominate an age and eventually to be the leader, key to the defeat of the most monstrous foe of the 20th century? And then the second question is even more interesting. How did he come to dominate his age in a way that was only recognized a generation after he had passed from the scene? And that is to say that Dwight Eisenhower is now considered a far better leader than he was in his own day. In his own time, Dwight Eisenhower was considered one amongst many generals, the 34th among presidents, and when he left office, he was not highly rated as the nation's chief executive by historians. But in more recent years, he's been ranked as high as 5 out of the more than 40 men who have served as President of the United States. In order to answer these questions, we do have to look at the man and his times. The Eisenhower family comes from Saarbrück, and they were, in their ancestry back to the 18th century, a part of the great Anabaptist migration to the New World. And that meant that they came, the ancestors of who became the 34th President of the United States, came to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania as a part of that Anabaptist migration. People think of it as Amish country, and it is, Amish and Mennonites. And the Eisenhower family was a part of the River Brethren branch of the Mennonites. Now, eventually, Dwight Eisenhower would become the third of 7 sons of David and Ida Eisenhower. And it's interesting to note that Dwight David Eisenhower is the son of David Dwight Eisenhower. And it was the father, David, who took his family from Lancaster County. They're kind of the heartland of the Anabaptists in the United States, the Amish and the Mennonites. And it was Eisenhower who was born in Texas, Denison, Texas, neither in Pennsylvania, where anyone would have expected him to be born in that family, or in Kansas, where actually Dwight Eisenhower grew up with the rest of his brothers and his family in Abilene, Kansas, a town which is mostly famous for having been the place of the childhood and the growth to adulthood of Dwight Eisenhower. He grew up on the American heartland, and there is probably no city in America that better represents that American heartland than Abilene, Kansas. So it was a trek from Saarbrück in Europe for the Eisenhower family, and then eventually through successive generations to Dwight Eisenhower in Abilene, Kansas. But no one would have assumed then that Dwight Eisenhower was born to greatness. First of all, he was one of 7 boys, and secondly, he was in Abilene, Kansas, and there was nothing to predict that he would one day write astride history and stand in the course of great human events, much less to lead them. Well, as you think about Dwight Eisenhower in this period, recognize that he's being formed by his parents. They were both strict disciplinarians. They were a religious family, and that's the very word that Eisenhower used. There were Bible readings and devotions in the morning and in the evening, according to the Mennonite practice. But Dwight was not understood as a boy to be a particularly religious young person. But he was active, physical, and ambitious. But he wasn't ambitious in the way that you would think of him later as Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, as a 5-star general, or as a President of the United States. But he was ambitious to do something that he couldn't do in Abilene, Kansas. And he, on the other hand, had very little family means to launch him into some kind of professional career. He had a friend who told him that his own plan was to go to the Naval Academy because there was no tuition. But Eisenhower, due to the work that he did after high school, was actually too old to be admitted to the Naval Academy. But he found out he was still young enough to be admitted to West Point. And so, in one of those turns of history that turns out to be providential, Dwight Eisenhower went to West Point because he was too old to get into the Naval Academy and too poor to go anywhere else. And he went to West Point and he found himself there. And of course, this was in the period that was leading up to America's involvement in what would become known as the First World War. And so as you're looking at Dwight Eisenhower, the young man graduating from West Point in the class of 1915, you have all these young men who are now looking at war that is tearing the world apart in Europe and wondering if America will get there, and then eventually wondering not if but when Americans will get there. And Dwight Eisenhower fully expected, intended, and wanted to be there, but he graduated in that class of 1915. And even as the Allied Expeditionary Force undertook action as America entered the war, and remember, America was active on the battlefield in World War I in Europe only really for a matter of months, but they were decisive months. And out of that, America emerged as the great world leader. But to his frustration, Eisenhower was sent to staff duty and mostly spent his time training, even serving as a football coach. As many of his biographers and as Eisenhower in his own memoirs reflected, he was unfortunately successful as a football coach, which meant that commanding officers didn't want him to stop coaching football, but that really isn't what he wanted to do. Instead, he wanted to fight and he wanted to lead in battle. But here's a very interesting thing. Of that class of West Point of 1915, that graduating class, 58, indeed, by one count, 59 of those graduates would become general officers, eventually generals of one rank or another in the United States Army. That's an extraordinary percentage, so much so that that class has been defined as the class the stars fell on, as in the stars of a general. But that appeared so unlikely after World War I that the United States military has to be recognized as entering its lowest point of the 20th century. That requires some explanation. After the mobilization of so many young soldiers for World War I, and after America made the decisive difference, it has to be said, in the victory in World War I, it became very clear that Americans were not ready for their nation to emerge as a great military power worldwide. Now, this has often been described as isolationism, and in some cases, especially later in the 1930s, isolationism would be an accurate description. But it really was an unwillingness on the part of Americans to see their still relatively young nation as a great player on the world scene. That wasn't their self-image of the United States, and thus they did not see the need for a vast American military, and particularly a standing army. And so they cut military expenditures so radically that by the time you get to, say, 1936, 37, 38, the United States has a military that by some count ranked the 17th largest in the world. And it was often compared with the military size of Belgium. And as one historian put it, that ranked the United States just under Portugal in terms of its military size and its expenditures on military. And this was a bitter political issue, but it was also a bipartisan political issue. At this point, in those decades between those two world wars, America did not see itself as an imperial power. It did not see itself as a power on the world stage, and it did not see itself as needing a big military. Now, that meant that an awful lot of the young men who went to West Point and the other military academies and were looking for a long-time career serving their country in the military, many of them had to face the reality that there was no real future for them. Now, just to give you one example, and we'll talk about this when we think about the virtues of Dwight Eisenhower, the man we eventually knew as General Eisenhower, indeed General of the Army Dwight Eisenhower, spent 16 years as a major. 16 years. And there were years during which you had all these young officers basically decide, and as they were approaching middle age, and some of them getting even older, some of them reached the point that they figured out there was no future in the military for them, and so they entered into private work and left the military. And so there was a thinning of the ranks at one point, even amongst the graduates of West Point and the other academies who were serving in the military. But we need to ask a question. What was really going on with Dwight Eisenhower during all of those years? Well, here's what was going on with Dwight Eisenhower. he was serving in a lot of posts that no one would ever remember in history. He was serving in a lot of places, both in the United States and beyond, where the postings were neither prestigious nor, again, memorable. He was serving in a situation in which the Army appeared to be planning to do very little for a very long time in the future. But what Dwight Eisenhower did, or what history did in the life of Dwight Eisenhower, was to place him in a close relationship with four of the most significant generals in the history of the American Army. And those four were Fox Connor, John J. Pershing, Douglas MacArthur, and George C. Marshall. For every single one of them, Dwight Eisenhower was a key staff officer. And he rose to prominence and to the attention of these commanders because of his extraordinary organizational ability. Now, here's something to think about. When we think about leadership now, we think about organizational ability. It just makes sense to us that a leader has experience in organizational leadership and understands how to organize. But we have to put this in the context and realize that that was really an emerging understanding of leadership. If you went back a matter of, say, even just a few decades, even in American military history, the quintessence of leadership was charisma and personality. Just think of people like George Armstrong Custer, and you just think of the fact that the people were remembered because of their personality and their charisma. And of course, a lot had happened in the world, just in terms of even the vast size of the armies. But as you think going backwards in history, you will remind yourself that many of the greatest military leaders, such as Napoleon, were indeed organizers who understood logistics. They understood the importance not only of manpower, but of materiel. And Dwight Eisenhower emerged as someone who could train officers and understood how to get that done, someone who could get troops ready for action and get troops rightly assigned to their responsibilities. He became known as someone who could, well, as would be said of others later, make the trains run on time. And in the military, that was an organizational skill that stood out. The second thing was he had a warm personality that meant that he made more friends than enemies, which in any context is an advantage, but in the military, over a period of time, was a big advantage. And it turned out, and this is key for history with Dwight Eisenhower, it turned out he could work with extremely prickly personalities. And you mentioned especially names like Douglas MacArthur and, George Patton, or later Bernard Law Montgomery. You have to figure out that Dwight Eisenhower could only do his job. And he did his job so well because he knew how to deal with very difficult and extremely strong personalities. Fox Connor was the first general to which Eisenhower was attached and from whom he learned so much. Fox Connor is not so well known, except to military historians, but his influence on other general officers, especially those who had fought in World War II, was absolutely massive. Eisenhower served with him beginning in 1921 when Fox Connor became the commanding officer of the 20th Infantry Brigade in Panama, and Eisenhower served with him for 3 years. Fox Connor, who would reach the rank of Major General, recognized in Eisenhower the makings of a great leader. No one knew what was in the horizon of history, but he saw in Eisenhower the material of a great leader, except he saw Eisenhower as lacking in something very important, and that was the knowledge of history. And so Fox Connor, taking Eisenhower under his tutelage, taught him to read history, and in particular military history. And so much so that Eisenhower would later say that he really was made as a general eventually by reading the military history that had been assigned to him by Fox Connor. This became very key to Eisenhower's understanding of leadership. Leaders are made by reading. Now, there's more to it than that, but Eisenhower would say there's not less to it than that. You have to absorb vast amounts of material and background and knowledge of history in order to know your place, not only in history, but in leadership. But Fox Connor was important for another reason. You remember that the posting was in Panama. Fox Connor understood international relations in a way that was very rare for an American general. And he understood war as war was developing in the 20th century. He had 3 military maxims that he taught to all who worked with him. Eisenhower picked up all 3, and you will hear all 3 of these in Eisenhower's leadership of World War II. Number 1, never fight unless you have to. Axiom number 2, never fight alone. And axiom number 3, never fight for long. Those 3 maxims were very key to Eisenhower's understanding of how to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. And of course, it was Eisenhower's ability, as we shall see, as one who could create this great Allied military effort in the European theater that became key. But how that was done was also a matter of fascination to Fox Connor, who said, if indeed you have to work with allies, then power is not enough. Persuasion becomes key. And again, Eisenhower picked that up. And when you look at his legacy, both as the Supreme Commander in Europe and as President of the United States, it is his ability to persuade that Eisenhower understood, as taught by Fox Connor, was key to leadership. Now, by the way, Pershing, when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, wanted Fox Connor to replace him, but that didn't happen. Instead, Douglas MacArthur replaced him. But before we get to MacArthur, we have to get to Pershing himself. Pershing, the most famous general, of course, of the American forces in World War I, who was the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces on the Western Front. He is known not only for being a decisive and victorious general, he's also known for his absolute insistence that when Americans are involved, the American Army is involved, it is involved as the leadership unit, independent of the command of other nations. Now, that was considered arrogant during World War I, but it was key. It was absolutely key. America would not have the posture it has in the world today if the United States had allowed its soldiers to be put under a European command in 1918 and in 1917, when the effort began to mobilize the Americans for war. Well, during the time that Eisenhower worked for Pershing, he accomplished what would probably now be considered something insignificant and boring, and that is that after World War II, he was issued responsibility to catalog and record for history all of the American battle monuments that would be placed in Europe in honor of American valor in World War I. Now, that sounds like a minor footnote to history, but it accomplished 2 things. Number 1, Eisenhower did his job extremely well, producing a volume of several hundred pages documenting the entire plan. But it also meant that he worked closely with General Pershing. And it eventually became so close that he helped Pershing writing his own memoirs. Well, here's something, again, that becomes very apparent in Dwight Eisenhower. When he was dealing with every single one of those commanders for whom he worked, he impressed them for his ability to get the job done and more, and quietly, and if not happily, then at least cooperatively and persuasively. During these years, Eisenhower also, just languishing in that army that was itself languishing, was trying to figure out whether he would stay in a career in the Army or would have to go elsewhere. But he had the opportunity to attend the Command and General Staff College as a major, by the way, and he did and learned a great deal there. And he also attended the Army War College. But all of that appeared to be something of a learning opportunity that might never be used or deployed in the context of war. Still a major. He was then assigned to serve as an aide to General Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur also had been Army Chief of Staff. And during that time he was Chief of Staff, Eisenhower worked for him in the latter period and then went with him to the Philippines, where, very famously, Douglas MacArthur went to the Philippines to try to create a professional army there in the Philippines. The Americans had figured out that in the Pacific theater, with a war with Japan looming, that the Philippines would be absolutely key. Douglas MacArthur himself developed a personal identity with the Philippines and eventually became a field marshal in the Philippine Army. Dwight Eisenhower served rather quietly but extremely effectively as an aide to MacArthur. Now, MacArthur was, to choose a word rather carefully, a prima donna. He was an overwhelming personality, and he was not used to having an aide like Eisenhower who pressed back on him on so many matters of policy. And as a matter of fact, again, the political context was very intense. And Eisenhower would have to be very skillful with the Philippine government in applying and describing and negotiating the plans that MacArthur had both for the American Army in the Philippines and the armed forces and for the Philippine Army itself. Now, when you look at two figures on the world scene, Douglas MacArthur and Dwight Eisenhower, here's what's very, very apparent. As you look in the early 1930s, MacArthur is famous, was already famous, was famous from his exploits and leadership in World War I, was famous as Army Chief of Staff, was loved and hated, respectively, by different constituencies, including the White House and those in the Army who served under him. Eisenhower was by far the lesser figure. People didn't think of Dwight Eisenhower as the future, as a great leader. They did think of Douglas MacArthur. But just think of history. By the time you get to the Second World War, Douglas MacArthur would be Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific Theater, and Dwight Eisenhower would be Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. History has very interesting twists and turns. But with Eisenhower and with MacArthur, those twists and turns would be even more interesting. And I'm going to fast forward just a moment, because in 1948, Douglas MacArthur coveted the Republican nomination as President of the United States. He wanted to run against Harry Truman, even into the Republican primaries, but it didn't go well. And of course, it was not MacArthur, but Thomas Dewey who became the 1948 Republican presidential nominee. He was defeated by Truman, famously. Just think of Truman holding up the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman. Truman is president. And MacArthur recedes at that point in the American mind and memory. He wanted to be president. There's no indication that Dwight Eisenhower at this stage ever thought of being president. But 4 years after Douglas MacArthur was hungry for the presidency and forbidden it, the presidency basically, in a very real sense, fell into the lap of Dwight Eisenhower, who was elected president in 1952. They described each other in very interesting terms. When Eisenhower was elected president of the United States, Douglas MacArthur quipped that Eisenhower was the best clerk he ever had. And when told that, Eisenhower conceded his debt of leadership and learning to Douglas MacArthur by saying that he studied dramatics with MacArthur for several years. They, nonetheless, as each wrote his memoirs, said very positive things about the other. But now we have Dwight Eisenhower with Douglas MacArthur learning, but it was George Marshall, who was the fourth of the great generals, to whom Dwight Eisenhower was attached and from whom he learned. And of course, this is as history is changing before American eyes. The threat of Nazi Germany is now undeniable. The question is, how can America get its armed forces ready? And George C. Marshall deserves enormous credit as Chief of Staff of the Army for his political skill and his military skill in getting the American military ready when the American people were not ready to pay the bills for a military, when there was the political fear that, that raising a military meant that Americans would enter into war. All of this was a part of the great concern that kept Americans, and this was the period that is rightly described as isolationist in many ways, kept Americans from admitting the reality of the Nazi threat, and Congress and the President from dealing with it. Now, Roosevelt saw it coming and was doing what he could do to try to bring the Army into larger numbers, to try to get an Army ready, both in materiel and in manpower. It was an arduous task, but Eisenhower was key to that task. And Eisenhower's organizational ability, again, became very, very clear. He learned lessons from Marshall, even as he had from MacArthur and from Pershing and from Fox Connor. And it was during this period that it was Marshall who helped to push Eisenhower forward. Now, as you think about this, remember that he spent 16 years as a major, but now what we would know as the Second World War is ramping up in a huge way. And so it comes down to this. I just want to walk you through a series of promotions of Dwight Eisenhower over a period of years. So he's working for George Marshall as Deputy Chief of the War Plans Division. And he becomes, first of all, in 1936, a lieutenant colonel. In 1941, temporary rank as brigadier general. And then he became a major general, again, temporary, in March of 1942. In July of the same year, that's July of 1942, he's promoted to a 4-star general. And so in a period of a very short amount of years, he goes from being a major to a 4-star general. And then in August of 1943, he's promoted to brigadier general as a permanent rank. And so here you have the difference between the temporary rank and the permanent rank. And his permanent rank is now catching up with his temporary rank, and in the most extraordinary way. In 1943, he will be appointed the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, and of course everyone knows that eventually this will mean the Allied invasion of Nazi-dominated Europe. It's not known exactly at that point how it would take place. By the way, Eisenhower was key in helping to make the case for a Europe first strategy. That is, even as the war would shape up after Pearl Harbor, with the threat of Imperial Japan as well as Nazi Germany, Eisenhower agreed with Churchill and with others and helped to persuade the American president and others that the first effort must be the defeat of Nazi Germany. Then the Allies would turn all of their attention to the Pacific. But at this point, in August of 1943, Ike is just, in terms of permanent rank, a brigadier general. But in 1943 becomes Supreme Allied Commander. In the next year, he is made General of the Army. That's 5 stars as his permanent rank. It was made permanent, actually, in 1946. So he's a 5-star general. But how did he get from 1 star to 5-star? Well, part of it took place in one day. In August of 1943, even as he was promoted that day to the permanent rank of brigadier general, later that same day, he was given permanent rank as major general. That's how fast things happened. He actually advanced in rank from a brigadier general to a major general in the course of 24 hours. And that says something about Ike. It says something about the times. It says something about George Marshall understanding the key role that Dwight Eisenhower will play. But again, you just look at it and you think, how could someone see this boy from Abilene, Kansas, who ended up at West Point because he was too old for the Naval Academy and was serving in the lowest point of the American Army for so many decades and was for 16 years a major? How is he now a 5-star general? And you have to say a lot of it had to do with Ike. A lot of it had to do with the generals Ike had served who believed in him. A lot of it had to do with the historical moment and the great need for someone like Dwight Eisenhower. Now, of course, as he served as Supreme Allied Commander, he undertook, under his leadership, so many different operations. The most famous of the early operations was Operation Torch in North Africa. And by most estimation, Eisenhower had a stable hand, but did not demonstrate stellar leadership. Now remember, he has a great disadvantage when compared to other generals of his day. And that's because, remember, that after he graduated from West Point, he didn't get sent to Europe with the AEF in World War I. And thus he lacked combat experience and certainly combat command in World War I. And just in terms of the worldview of the Army and many of his peers, that meant that he was not qualified, as someone else might be, for this role. But both Roosevelt and Marshall saw him as absolutely key. And of course, after Operation Torch, various operations, including the American invasion of Sicily, and eventually Italy, but it was the invasion of France that was the big issue, the largest military operation, Operation Overlord, ever undertaken in human history. And that remains so today. And it will almost assuredly always be the most massive military operation in world history, because warfare has changed so much with the development of intercontinental missiles and jet aircraft and other high technology means, that it is unlikely that there will ever be the meeting of armies, massive armies, as happened in the last years of World War II. Now, Eisenhower during that period had to be a politician as well as a general, and this is what's really key. He had to work with Charles de Gaulle, the very definition of prickly, whom he also understood, as did Churchill and Roosevelt, as essential. He had to work with Churchill himself. And the problem with working with Churchill is that Churchill was almost always the dominating presence in any room. But at that point, we have to recognize America is clearly leading the effort. There's no question that it would be an American general who would be Supreme Commander. And so the British in general, and Churchill in particular, had to be satisfied with an American leader who would not lord it over the British. And Eisenhower fulfilled that role spectacularly and is so well remembered. Bernard Law Montgomery, who was himself, like MacArthur, someone who saw himself as the greatest military leader in whatever room in which he was situated, he often chafed under Eisenhower, both in Eisenhower's decisions and the fact that Eisenhower, this American, was supreme commander. But later, Monty, as he was known to his own troops, said that he had never actually been able to resent Eisenhower because of Eisenhower's personality. And he spoke of Eisenhower's disarming smile. And he said when Eisenhower smiles, and he knew how to deploy that smile, and a gentle touch with a firm hand, American leadership was sustained, and the British and other allies were well mobilized and well led under that American leadership. And another American general might have failed in this task, and that's key. And it's often said that Eisenhower got this role because Marshall declined it. That's technically true, but not very helpful. Because actually Roosevelt, as president, came to the conclusion that he could not do without Marshall as chief of staff in Washington, and for personal as well as political reasons. And yet, Marshall's stature meant that he could not fail to offer Marshall the leadership of the American and Allied effort in Europe, and especially what would become Operation Overlord. And so, being himself a tactician of masterclass, Roosevelt went to Marshall with the question as to whether or not he would choose to stay as chief of staff or to serve as the supreme commander in Europe. Marshall desperately wanted to lead the European effort, but he understood President Roosevelt, and he understood Roosevelt's need. And it was actually a self-sacrificial decision that he made, but he also knew that Roosevelt had really made the decision that when Roosevelt asked him the question, he had loaded it with the answer that Marshall had to give, that instead Eisenhower would lead the effort in Europe and Marshall would stay at home. And history honors George Marshall for that incredible role he played, and of course later he stayed very active in history as Secretary of State and the author of what became known as the Marshall Plan for the rescue of Europe. But back to Eisenhower, in the course of the war, this greatest challenge was tactical and strategic and political, and that was figuring out how in the world to construct this massive invasion that would be successful. And it had to be successful in levels that most Americans now don't think about. The invasion was one thing. They had to be successful in the beginning, but Eisenhower understood that the greatest difficulty would be in the immediate weeks after the invasion. And that's where his organizational skills came to the fore. If you have an army that even successfully, or an invasion of armies that is successful in creating a beachhead there in France, in Normandy, holding it is going to be just as difficult as establishing it. And again, a general without the organizational skills of Eisenhower might well not have come up with a plan that was eventually as successful as was Operation Overlord. Eisenhower's leadership in the military was never unquestioned in terms of decisions that he made. In the legacy of World War II, the greatest blame that is assessed to Eisenhower is the failure to recognize the Nazi threat that would become very clear coming out of the Ardennes in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. But nonetheless, Eisenhower was, as a Supreme Commander, able to rally the Allied forces rather quickly to hasten the defeat of Nazi Germany. And it was extremely political. You had the Russians coming from the Soviets, we should say, coming from the east, and the Americans and the British, along with some others, but primarily the Americans and the British, along with some of the French, moving from the west. The question is, of course, who will cross the Rhine, who will take Berlin. Very political. Those decisions not all made by Eisenhower, but never made without him. After the war, and there's so much that goes on to this, you have Eisenhower who has to make a decision, and it came down to weather. And those of you who know the history of World War II and D-Day, you know that Eisenhower had to make a horrifying decision based upon what we would now consider to be insanely rudimentary weather data and forecasting. He decided to go forward, and that turned out to be providentially exactly the right thing to do, but he knew it was at stake and actually had written a letter taking full responsibility for a failed invasion. He carried it in his pocket. By the way, later in life, of course, he became known as an avid golfer as president, and people would ask him about the weather, and he said, "I never care about the weather. The last time I cared about the weather was D-Day, and after that, I will never care about the weather again." After the successful war of the Allies, of course, Eisenhower stays in Europe for a period of time as the military general of the liberated Europe, and there again, it was a political role with military ramifications. But things then moved rather quickly. What would Eisenhower do after the war? That service as the military general was temporary, and Eisenhower was restless. He came back to the United States and eventually took the role as the president of Columbia University. That's a part of Eisenhower's biography a lot of people forget, but he spent this couple of years, 1948 to 1950, as the president of an Ivy League university, and this was a rocky role for Eisenhower. Not that he was unaccustomed to leadership, he was just unaccustomed to academic leadership and to working with academics. Now, I just have to insert here, evidently, working with academics is a challenge that even daunted Dwight Eisenhower, which is to say, you're working with people who don't see themselves as part of an army at a university like Columbia. And at Columbia, you had so many people who had PhD degrees. Eisenhower, of course, did not have one. All he had done was win the war and save democracy and liberty. But it was a mismatched role in many ways. Eisenhower's brother Milton, by the way, would serve as president of several major American universities, and and at one point, by the way, was better known in the United States than was his brother, who, remember, was a major for 16 years. But nonetheless, he didn't stay at Columbia for long, and this is key. In 1950, he was named Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now that's key, coming out of the ruins of World War II and the Allied determination to create a unified military command that would not stare down Nazi Germany, but would be ready to stare down Soviet Russia. And once again, this is a political as well as a military role. No one is conceivable in that role except Dwight David Eisenhower. And so with his 5-star rank, he goes to be the commanding general of Allied forces in NATO. That's 1950. But then things are changing again. At the end of World War I, you'll remember that Woodrow Wilson had his peace plan and wanted to create the League of Nations. You'll remember the United States never entered the League of Nations. It was a failed project. America's commitment to internationalism was extremely controversial at the end of World War I. It was less controversial at the end of World War II. It's more controversial now. I mean, whether you take Britain with Brexit or you take President Trump's approach to many American treaties and even to NATO itself, these things are controversial and new because largely because historically the Soviet Union is not the threat that it once was. But when you go to the end of World War II, I said that's a bit different. Americans were now more committed to an internationalist understanding because America is now the great power on the world scene. And once you've had millions and millions of American troops and forces in both the Pacific theater and in the European theater, you have an American changed vision of the world. And America doesn't want to be the world's policeman, but it's unavoidable that America will have to make major decisions and often exercise decisive leadership. So NATO became a part of that. But there was an isolationist strain. And that isolationist strain in the Republican Party threatened to dominate. And that isolationist strain in the Republican Party was associated mostly with Senator Robert A. Taft, the son of the president, William Howard Taft. And Taft was Mr. Republican. And he had sought the Republican presidential nomination repeatedly, and it was almost assured that Taft would gain the nomination in 1952. Taft was not a supporter of NATO. Taft was described as something of an isolationist. Now, Eisenhower is not an isolationist. Given his biography, he couldn't be. Two things came to Eisenhower's mind. Number one, America is about to become a one-party country. Democrats had been electing presidents. You just think of Roosevelt for 4 terms, and then Harry Truman elected on his own in 1948. And he was certain that Robert Taft would be defeated. And that would just mean an unbroken line of Democratic supremacy, not only with majorities in Congress throughout many of those years, but dominating in the White House. Eisenhower, the general who had had to serve in so many political roles, understood that would not be healthy for the country. But he also was very much concerned about a lack of support for NATO, and he saw the emergence of Robert Taft and his isolationist philosophy as dangerous to the world, not only to the Republican Party. And many people came to the conclusion that there was only one person who could run for the Republican presidential nomination and defeat Taft, and thus defeat the isolationist strain in America. Now, Taft, I want to say, here's a footnote, I want to defend Robert Taft a bit here. He was more than just what would be described as an isolationist. He was also a classical conservative, and in many ways, American political conservatism today looks back to Robert Taft as a pole star of sorts, in terms not only of his international understandings, but of his understandings of American domestic policy and political philosophy. So much so that when Eisenhower decides to run for the Republican nomination in '52 and defeats Taft, well, Eisenhower is hated by many of those in the American conservative ranks, including people like William F. Buckley Jr. Now, I say hated, that's a strong word, but it was felt by Buckley and others that Eisenhower had stopped in 1952 the conservative ascendancy in the Republican Party. Now, again, why do I say that? Because some of the strains you know today in the Republican Party are those strains. They are still there. But Eisenhower was elected president in 1952. How? I mean, and as what? Here's the amazing thing. No one knew that he was a Republican. And as a matter of fact, both the Democrats and the Republicans were interested in Eisenhower running for president. Both parties had some interest in Eisenhower running for president in 1948. Now, of course, Truman's the incumbent president. He becomes the nominee, but he's afraid that Eisenhower is going to run as a Republican against him. Eisenhower assures him, I'm not going to do that. But he does run as the Republican nominee in 1952. He sees it as a way to establish NATO and internationalism as a part of America's fighting philosophy, and he wants to rescue, as he sees it, the two-party system. But Eisenhower never becomes Mr. Republican in a way that Taft had been Mr. Republican, or others, including his vice president, Richard Nixon, would be Mr. Republican. And it's contestable whether Eisenhower was really much of a conservative. And it's very difficult actually to come up with a governing philosophy of Dwight Eisenhower. But let me just remind you, he was elected president twice. In 1952, he defeated Adlai Stevenson, very liberal intellectual figure, by the way, who had the Illinois governor who had the Democratic nomination. He had an electoral college win that was massive, 442 to 89. And he ran against Stevenson again in 1956 and actually bested what he'd done in 1952, winning an electoral college victory of 457 to 73. Eisenhower is president. Just think with me for a moment. The 38th president of the United States is noteworthy, I think, historically for 13 reasons. I'm just going to mention them. Number one, the emergence of the United States as the dominant world power of the West. It took Eisenhower's experience as Supreme Commander, as the commander of NATO, to understand how to describe to the American people in this great period of that strategic decade, especially the 50s, what America's role must be as the dominant world power. Secondly, he helped to define the Cold War against the Soviet Union. He did so in tandem with his famous Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And together, they basically applied what would become known as containment, the effort to contain the spread and expansion of Soviet communism around the world, indeed global communism around the world. The third issue is the nuclear age. Eisenhower didn't know what to think of nuclear weapons. No one did when all of a sudden they came in 1945 at the end of World War II and really brought about the sudden conclusive end to the war against Imperial Japan. But the great debate as to whether nuclear weapons are a part of normal warfare or not. Interestingly, Eisenhower seemed in the beginning to think that nuclear weapons might be a part of normal warfare. But as president, he came increasingly to the conclusion that the result will be annihilation. And so you see that the turn also in American and, frankly, to some extent, Soviet understandings of the cost of a nuclear exchange. Fourth, NATO. American commitment to NATO and ultimate leadership in NATO, very key. Eisenhower also believed that the Allies should contribute more to the defense of Western Europe than they did or than they have. You see those strains also very much right now. In the United States, a period, fifth, of economic prosperity. The baby boom is exploding. You have the rising middle class. And Eisenhower is remembered in the 50s for a booming economy, and in general it was. And it was America, again, moving into economic greatness, unleashing the energies that came out of the winning of World War II more than anything else, and America's role in the world. Sixth, the interstate highway system. We drive on those highways all the time. Eisenhower really had that idea, very frustrated. And if he had been born on the East Coast or the West Coast, he might never have come up with the interstate highway system. But he was born in Texas and, of course, raised in Abilene, Kansas. And it took a long time by car to get anywhere, car or truck, anywhere in the United States. It was extremely uneconomical. You had all these local jurisdictions. You had roads that were of varying quality and repair. It was one problem after another. It could take weeks to drive much distance in the United States. Eisenhower had seen the Autobahns in Germany and understood that given the massive size and the transcontinental immense of the United States, the interstate highway system would be key, first of all, to unleashing the economic energies of the country. And it is. It has been. It's more than that. It was also built with at least some military significance in mind. But it's now called officially the Eisenhower Interstate System. Seventh, the National Security Council. It existed before, but Eisenhower, having served in such high posts of military service, understood that the National Security Council in the White House was going to be key to the day-to-day security of the United States. And so he, again, given his organizational ability, organized the National Security Council. And by the way, that was weakened by his successor, John F. Kennedy, and is largely blamed for some of the failures, especially the Bay of Pigs, and even some of the great risk in the Cuban Missile Crisis because the NSC had been neglected. And it shows you the difference, if you're going to explain it in military terms, between someone who served as a rather junior officer and someone who served as Supreme Commander. You have a different view of the importance of something like the National Security Council. In court appointments, of course, serving 2 terms, President Eisenhower appointed all kinds of federal judges, but he appointed 5 justices of the Supreme Court, including Earl Warren, who had been appointed by Eisenhower in 1953. And Warren, a fascinating figure himself, at one point was both the Democratic and the Republican nominee, serving as governor of California. And it was as governor of California, he was tapped by Eisenhower to be Chief Justice. Eisenhower later regretted that he had done so, but nonetheless, it was a decisive appointment. It also points to the fact that Republicans during this time are basically not giving that much attention to judicial philosophy. Again, fast forward to 2020, you understand how electing a Republican president for many years did not lead to any kind of correction on the Supreme Court. It took intentionality that came only in the last few decades by Republican presidents. Civil rights. Eisenhower, of course, was president as the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down. He sought a gradualist approach in applying it across the country. But when there was absolute defiance, as in Little Rock, Arkansas, he sent in the 101st Airborne Division in order to enforce the court's decree for the desegregation of schools there. Again, massively controversial decision constitutionally, but made a very clear point. Ike was still a commanding general in this sense. He has to be remembered 10th for the heart attack that he suffered in 1955. The White House basically hid from America how damaged Eisenhower's heart was. And of course, he would run for president for a second term in 1956. Americans would never, I think it's fair to say, have elected Ike to a second term if they had had any idea of how devastating his heart attack was and how medically mismanaged it was. But nonetheless, Ike did survive. But Richard Nixon basically operated in many ways as president, standing in when President Eisenhower was debilitated and unable. Eisenhower never adequately appreciated Nixon for that, and because Nixon was always deferential, never tried to put himself forward. But Eisenhower never had a great relationship with Nixon. Vietnam, Eisenhower is actually the progenitor. He's actually the one who came up with the words, the domino theory, or at least he explained it as a set of dominoes, that if Vietnam fell to communist aggression, then all of Southeast Asia would fall. The domino theory did not stand well over time, but it was apparent that it looked that way during the Eisenhower years. The French were failing in Vietnam. Eisenhower did not want to inject massive American forces into Vietnam, but he didn't want Vietnam to fall. Of course, by the time his successor escalates, eventually Vietnam becomes an enormous quagmire and one of the most controversial actions in American history. But Eisenhower was the one who underlined the strategic nature of Vietnam. It could not be allowed to fall lest all of Southeast Asia would fall. In 1960, in the end of the Eisenhower administration, the greatest problem emerged for Eisenhower when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory. And the CIA informed Eisenhower that the plane had been shot down, but also told him that there was absolutely no chance that the pilot had survived and thus could be identified or much less interrogated by the Soviets. But as we now know, Nikita Khrushchev held a press conference and produced Francis Gary Powers, who was the American pilot. This led to not only a humiliation for the United States, but also the one moment in Eisenhower's legacy in which he had allowed what can only be described as an untruth to be communicated to the American people and internationally, something he regretted thereafter tremendously. And you can understand in the moment how it was the tensions of the Cold War. It's almost impossible for us to rewind and understand that. But that was the point at which Eisenhower also came to the conclusion that he couldn't trust the analysis of the CIA. His farewell address after his vice president, Richard Nixon, has been narrowly defeated by John F. Kennedy, his farewell address to the nation as he was leaving office, he warned about what he called a military-industrial complex. And this was something that Eisenhower saw. It's often cited by politicians today, but the point is that Eisenhower saw a symmetry, a synthesis, a synergy between the military and industry in such a way that he saw it threatening American democracy. And this was in the midst of the Cold War. The fact is, just to be honest, no American president has known what to do with that since Ike said it. And there still is a military-industrial complex, and there's almost no way around it. But that was Eisenhower's prophetic word, lest the military swallow its nation. Okay, Eisenhower was incredibly popular, often reaching 70% popularity, 80% at one point after the Geneva summit with the Soviets in 1955. Those are spectacular numbers. American presidents don't get near those numbers, certainly for any period of time. But Eisenhower befuddled his friends and his enemies. How was he doing this? Was he a do-nothing president? Was he a do-little president? Was he basically a president who played golf and let staff run the country? No one appeared really to be ready to answer that question. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in about 1960, rating the presidents, and of course he was very close to JFK, but it's just important here, he ranked Ike 28th out of 33, and that was pretty much an historical consensus. Let's just say that's the bottom of the barrel, 28 out of 33 presidents at the time. People, when Eisenhower left office, said he wasn't that great a president. Great general, mediocre president, not sure what he did. But recently, he has been rather consistently ranked in the top 10 American presidents out of 45 and has often been ranked as high as 5. What happened? Well, here's what happened. Over a period of history after Eisenhower left office, he started looking better and better. Just think of this. Eisenhower was the only successful president in electoral and political terms until Ronald Reagan, who was elected in 1980. Now, that's a long period of time. But every president between Eisenhower and Reagan ended in scandal or political defeat or what was considered to be an ineffectual legacy. And oftentimes, all you have to think about is Watergate, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the collapse of the Great Society in the end of the Johnson administration, and you just fast forward, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, until Ronald Reagan, and by the way, we understand that only in history too. People didn't know where Eisenhower really fit. But in 1982, Fred Greenstein wrote a book entitled The Hidden Hand Presidency. It's very interesting. Greenstein argued, okay, here's the deal. It turns out that Ike was really running everything. Now, we didn't know it, said Greenstein at the time. We didn't know it. That's why it was the hidden hand presidency. But it turns out he was really running things. He was doing a whole lot more than we thought. He was really in command of the American government and of his administration. Well, the historians debated that. But then as time goes on, more archival material becomes open, more files become declassified. And as it turns out, and historians are now pretty much agreed, Eisenhower was not a hands-off president, he was hands-on. But as politically skillful as he was in World War II, in getting things done without becoming the main character on the stage in a drama, turned out that's how he had played the presidency as well. And so Eisenhower's remembered now. And so I go back to those two questions. How did he come to dominate an age? 16-year major becomes 5-star general. But then how did he now come to be seen as dominating an age when no one seemed to recognize that he was doing so at the time? Well, it comes down to leadership and the fact that the times and the leader have to hit at some point in common, and then everything is made different. Well, just very quickly, a few points about Eisenhower. What we learned from him: first, organization. We see this Eisenhower the general and Eisenhower the president. A leader who can't organize is a leader who's not, in the end, a leader. There's no effectiveness without organization. There's more to leadership than organization, but there's never less to it. Infrastructure. He believed in infrastructure. Institutions, organizations, nations, armies need stuff. And they need ways of obtaining and maintaining stuff. They need the right stuff. They need to know what the right stuff is. Infrastructure is important. And that was really key to the growth of America and of the American government during the period of the Eisenhower years. Third, personal warmth. And again, he had emotional intelligence. That's a term that has only emerged in the last several decades. But like, again, Ronald Reagan, another successful two-term Republican president, he exuded personal warmth. Now, like Reagan, he was not so warm in person. People who worked with Reagan will say he had the amazing ability to be warm in a large context, but not so warm in a tighter context. Eisenhower was that way. It was like other leaders, he could kind of turn on a switch. And it was natural growing up as he did in a family of 7 boys. Fourth, a basic optimism about life. And optimism can be false or it can be genuine, but Eisenhower had every reason to believe that America would prevail, that righteousness and truth would prevail. And that gave him a basic optimism in life. He told the truth. Again, a basic commitment, with the exception of that U-2 incident. Telling the truth is extremely important for leaders. And when it doesn't happen, disaster ensues. Patience. The patience of waiting in the United States Army when it didn't appear that there would be any real future for him. That patience was richly rewarded. Loyalty up the ladder, 7. Eisenhower was a very good staff officer. So good, he was almost assuredly the most outstanding staff officer in the American Army in his era. And there'd be many who have been dissatisfied with that, but actually serving as staff officer is what prepared him to become the supreme commander. 8th, he described his own leadership as the middle way. And this is an interesting thing politically. And again, he wasn't even known to be a Republican until he became a Republican candidate for president. I wasn't known for a clear political philosophy. That middle way, I would argue, was only made possible because there was a huge political consensus during the 1950s. You couldn't tell a lot of difference between the Republican and the Democratic parties on policies or on issues. And certainly the great moral issues of our day had not emerged. So I could afford a middle way in a way that I don't believe any president really thereafter could afford. So this is one part of Eisenhower's legacy. He could be a moderate but very few moderates could emerge in leadership after him. America has changed, and in many ways, we're looking at two different visions of the nation. Active leadership, again, not just a hidden hand, but a very active hand. One of the things I think about with Eisenhower, just very quickly, is that he was able to exercise virtues at the right time. And so one of the things about Eisenhower is he demonstrated tremendous courage, but no one knew he had it. You didn't have to have tremendous courage when you're writing the history of the military monuments in Europe. It's courage when courage was needed, the virtues that show up just at the right time. He was secure in his own self-knowledge, long experience studying leaders. He had a sense of history and his place in it, and a commitment to America as a nation. He was convinced of American greatness. He wasn't too concerned with whether history would record Eisenhower greatness. And there's greatness in that. He saw the greatness in his country. Gene Edward Smith, one of the defining biographers of Eisenhower, put it this way, quote, "Dwight Eisenhower remains an enigma. For the majority of Americans, he is a benign fatherly figure looking indistinctly out of the mist of the past, a high-ranking general who directed the Allied armies to victory in Europe, and a caretaker president who presided over 8 years of international peace and domestic tranquility. To those who knew him, Ike was a tireless taskmaster who worked with incredible subtlety to move events in the direction he wished them to go. Most would agree he was a man of principle, decency, and common sense, whom the country could count on to do what is right. In both war and peace, he gave the world confidence in American leadership." That's why I wanted to talk about Dwight Eisenhower today. Always a general, Dwight David Eisenhower, in war and in peace. And I look forward to a discussion about Eisenhower and his leadership. And for that, we'll be right back.
I know you enjoyed Dr. Mohler's lecture about President Eisenhower. Well, now we're going to move into the question and answer session, and I know you're going to enjoy it just as much. Some questions have already been submitted, and Dr. Mohler will begin with those. But as you listen, I know you're going to have questions that you're going to want him to answer. I don't think you can stump him, so do not hesitate. Please feel free, and you submit your questions now.
If the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Boyce College mean anything, it must mean that we are here in the name of truth.
Trust. It's something that's earned. It doesn't come quickly. It's the result of being time-tested, by enduring in times of trial and being found faithful. When the trustworthiness of God's Word was being challenged, we stood for truth. When other institutions traded their principles for their bottom line, we stayed committed to the faith once for all delivered to the saints, regardless of the consequences. When many offer faster, easier, simpler, we embrace deeper, richer, and stronger. Because in the end, we place our trust on the truth that endures. That's why Southern Seminary is trusted. Trusted for a faculty that's renowned for the highest standards of biblical scholarship. Trusted for graduates fully equipped to rightly divide the Word of God. Trusted for alumni who boldly proclaim the message of Christ around the world. Trusted for leaders who are shaping the next generation of faithful pastors. Trusted for a degree that represents years of rigorous study, deep spiritual formation, and an unshakable dedication to the call to ministry. Because we're the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and we are trusted for truth.
Well, thanks for joining with us today. In order to participate with sending a question or a comment, just text to 502-209-8017. That's again 502-209-8017. We have a couple of things already been sent. Andy from Georgia asking, what were the toughest wartime and peacetime decisions Eisenhower had to make? I think when it comes to wartime, the big issue has to be, one, the timing and the dimensions and the location of the D-Day invasion. And in the end, the timing was the most excruciating question. It comes down to the matter of weather. But I also want to say, as a leader, some of the hardest decisions in World War II that Eisenhower had to make were about command. And like repeated questions of what to do. He had to sack generals. He had to evaluate generals. He had to promote generals. And he had to deal with people like George S. Patton. And so as it turned out, Ike was a tremendous judge of command leadership. And that meant in the American Army, but also in the larger Allied effort. He figured out how to deploy commanders, and he stuck with commanders even after they had experienced setbacks or failures, but not when he thought they were spent in terms of their credibility. And at that point, he took decisive action. But those were very hard decisions, and also political. Colonel Tim Moore, some observers have lamented the recent decline in leadership within the military, especially as ranking generals have embraced the slide towards secular progressivism infecting our greater culture. Do you see warning signs in our current moment in history? Yes, Colonel Moore, I do. And I'll tell you, a part of it is that the leadership education, the academic structure of our military academies is a part of that larger academic context, which has been almost overwhelmingly taken over by the academic left. And so that's a huge problem. And generals, and you know, I know some who've told me straight out, they are put in context now in which many, and it's not just generals, but it's officers in the American military, are evaluated according to standards that on inclusivity and tolerance and other things are basically being written by the same folks who are writing the rules for corporations and universities on LGBTQ issues and many things. And there's this basic divide. And so it goes back, you know, Tim, I go back to the Eisenhower years as president in the 1950s. There was a common moral judgment on the part of Americans about almost every major moral issue. And by the way, that included civil rights in the sense that the American people overwhelmingly believed that segregation was wrong and should be remedied. The question was by what means and how fast. But that entire moral cohesiveness is broken apart with the sexual and moral revolutions that have taken place. And behind that is the secularization of the culture. So I share that concern. I'm thankful for so many wonderful, committed Americans and American Christians who are serving in the military and are serving in the leadership ranks, the officer ranks of the military. We need to pray for them and be thankful for them. John from Georgia made mention of Fox Connor teaching Eisenhower how to read military history. As I read military history, how do I do it? What am I looking for? Do I annotate while reading? Yeah, so John, great question. Military history is just about my most favorite avocational reading, along with fiction. They're very different, but I have to read kind of for my own sanity a good bit of both. And it's historical biography, which, so it's not just military, but historical biography. And yes, I annotate. I have some rare books that I would never touch with a pen. They stay pristine and preserved. But the books I use in my working library, which is the vast majority, they got marks all over them. I use a red flare pen in my hand. I'm making notes all over the place. I have an ink pen very close by. I have my own system of symbols. I'm going to do a video, a lecture on just the kind of system I've developed for myself in hopes it might be helpful to others. But and then I keep those books with all my notes. In other words, I keep the notes in the book. So I write on the page. So I don't have to go find my notes about that book. It's right in the book. I can pull it out. Thinking about Eisenhower, I was able to go and pull just all kinds of volumes off the shelf in my library, and all the notes I had about Eisenhower were there, including notes that I took about Fox Connor, teaching him how to read and to read military history. And so, yep, that's a great question, John. Thank you. Scott from Cashton, Wisconsin, you mentioned Ike's faith as a child. What role influence did his faith play in his leadership, both as general and president? You know, Ike described himself as the most religious man he knew, which doesn't ring really true. It tells you something about how Ike saw himself, but that doesn't ring particularly true during the time that he was either general or president. And there's a part of Ike's family's historical biography that isn't often mentioned, and that's the fact that Eisenhower's mother, this is fascinating, by the way, as River Brethren, they were pacifists. And by the way, Ike's mother, Ida, never reconciled herself to the fact that her son was Supreme Commander of Allied forces fighting Nazi Germany. She was still a pacifist. Something that, by the way, was not advertised to the American Army because no one exactly knew what to do with the Supreme Commander whose mother was a pacifist. But nonetheless, his mother became a Jehovah's Witness. Now, you'll see that in almost none of the records. Ike doesn't mention it. Ike's granddaughter, Susan Eisenhower, in writing about her grandfather, doesn't mention it. Mentions the River Brethren, doesn't mention the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses had meetings in the Eisenhower house when Eisenhower was a boy, but Eisenhower never became a Jehovah's Witness. In fact, through most of his life, he was not considered anything. Now, here's the twist and turn to that story. On the other hand, Dwight David Eisenhower is the only president of the United States to receive Christian baptism as president. Now, I'm a Baptist, so I'm going to have to say he received what he and his Presbyterian church called baptism. Wasn't enough water for a Baptist, but nonetheless, it was a decisive act. No other president of the United States has been baptized in that sense in office. Now, why was Eisenhower baptized in 1952? Well, let me give you two readings. So there's a secular reading of Eisenhower, and there is a more Christian reading of Eisenhower. Here's the secular reading. Eisenhower believed that as a part of American identity in the Cold War, Americans needed a religious identity, and for Americans that would be a Christian identity, and he needed a way to express his Christian identity. He resisted joining a church, but he said, and this sounds rather cynical, he said, but joining a specific church would be easier to answer than saying I'm a Christian but not a member of any church. Instead, he said, it's going to be easier to say I'm a Presbyterian. Okay? You understand that. Now, there's more to that story, because Eisenhower is actually a part of America's theological history. And this is true whether you take the secular reading or the more Christian reading. In the secular reading, Eisenhower believed that one of the distinctions between secular godless communism and American democracy was the Christian faith and commitment behind America. And so he said, and this is from a speech he gave in 1952. So this is December, this is a month before his inauguration. Eisenhower says this, quote, and this is how they, meaning the Founding Fathers, explained those rights. Quote, we hold that all men are endowed by their Creator. Eisenhower went on, not by accident of their birth, not by the color of their skins or by anything else, but all men are endowed by their Creator. In other words, said Eisenhower, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it's the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion with all men, in which all men are created equal, end quote. Now, Eisenhower's now gone down in American theological history as the guy who said every nation needs to have a great religious faith, and I don't care what it is. Now, there are different readings of that. One of them is that in the main, he was speaking like of denominations, but the context seems to say that even as he looks at the world, and it could be Buddhism in some country, there has to be a theological center. Now, this is why American theologians say, well, if you look back to the 1950s, what you see there is the emergence of civil religion. It's not genuine Christianity. It's an official state-dependent religious faith that, just given our history, happens to be Christianity here. Now, as an evangelical theologian, I want to tell you, there really is something to this argument about civil religion. A lot of Americans say they're Christians because they're Americans, and there's no real gospel, biblical Christianity there at all. So that's a key issue. And Eisenhower is here kind of blamed as the godfather of civil religion. Now, again, the cynical secular reading is Eisenhower had no real religious faith, but he believed the American people needed some kind of religious faith, and so he was baptized, became a Presbyterian, because he was this advocate of civil religion. So that's the secular reading. But there's a different reading, and I'd recommend a book to you to see this other reading. It's by Alan Sears, who's a good friend of mine, Craig Austin and Ryan Cole. The title is The Soul of an American President. And they make a very convincing case for the fact that Eisenhower did become a believing Christian and remained actively engaged as a believing Christian with the church until the very point of his death. And just for the sake of time, I can't recapitulate the whole argument, but they pull out a great deal of material. So, and they openly confront that secular reading of Eisenhower. And here's one of the problems, and I'm going to have to end answering this question. I could talk about this for a long time. It energizes me. But here's one of the last things to think about. In the 20th century, looking at a figure like Eisenhower, you have to recognize on both sides of the Atlantic in the English-speaking world, there was a reticence for leaders to talk about their personal religious convictions because it appeared unseemly. So whether you're talking about Churchill or Roosevelt, or you could just go down the list, there wasn't much conversation. You really don't have the kind of conversations that now in the United States we expect. And so I'll just tell you that when the 1980 Republican nomination race was heating up, a group of conservative Christian pastors met with the various Republican candidates. D. James Kennedy, then pastor of the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church of Fort Lauderdale and the father of evangelism explosion, was one of those pastors. And he would ask every one of those contenders for the Republican nomination, if you were to die today and you were to stand before God and he was to say, why should I let you into heaven, how would you answer him? And are you sure today if you would die? If you know EE, you know I've reversed those questions and paraphrased them, but if you were to die today, are you certain you can go to heaven? A lot of the candidates absolutely fumbled it. Ronald Reagan was ready with an answer, and that's a part of how that cemented bond came about. But the thing is, here's the thing. Until D. James Kennedy asked those questions in 1980, no one had dared ask presidential candidates those questions. And so we know much more because people are now asking the questions in a way they did not in the past. Randy from Simi Valley, General Schwarzkopf famously placed competence and character high on the list of leadership requirements. Eisenhower took command of the Allied theater with no combat experience. Where would Eisenhower place competence on the leadership resume? Well, here's the interesting thing. And Eisenhower understood this. He was frustrated by it. Again, he wanted combat experience in World War I, but he didn't have that opportunity. But he knew those who did. And so, at the top of the Allied operational command, Eisenhower knew how to put the people with the greatest competence for the greatest need where they needed to be. And that's a competence. And so it's a matter of deploying the people who have the right combat experience. And look, this is an ongoing problem in the American military. And it's the problem of long periods of peace. And I mean that in terms of the absence of a major war. As you look from 1776 and go forward, you would have leaders forged in a certain crucible of war, and then they would age out. And so, or they would have a different kind of experience. The people who had experience in the first Gulf War have a different kind of American military experience than those who've been involved in the ongoing American efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those who were in Vietnam had a very different kind of experience than those who were in the Second World War. So a part of it is that understanding of history. It takes a far larger canvas. Colonel John Scherer, United States Air Force, thank you for writing. Monterey, California. Did I read Going Home to Glory in your preparation for this lecture on General Eisenhower? Yeah, yes, I did. And again, there's so many good books out there on Eisenhower. I tell you what, I will put together a list of books that I'll give to our folks, and they can put it up. I'll tell you that the book that probably sparked my interest in this talk today, just in terms of the timing, was the book Generals in the Making, that had a great deal to do with MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton, and others between the wars and what was happening to them. And I'll be honest, I found that absolutely fascinating. And we'll put that bibliographic information up so that people can find it. By the way, the other issue of timing, which I didn't say in the address for sake of time, is that just in the last few days, the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. has been open. And the reason I didn't give it a lot of time is because it itself is, to me, something of a fiasco. In our postmodern, confused time, we're not sure what to say about a man of historical greatness like Eisenhower. I don't think the monument is equal to the man in this sense. It represents a lot of confusion. And by the way, the Eisenhower family fought it being done because Frank Gehry and his group, the architect, and by the way, if you've seen his designs, you can't imagine anything more unlike Eisenhower. It became a matter of kind of white-knuckled political fight. But the memorial's open, and despite the fact that I think it's certainly going to be underwhelming in terms of sending the message, I think a far more classicist monument would have been called for. I promise you I'll go see it the next time I'm in Washington, that's for sure. Alex from North Carolina, would Ike get elected in 2020 with his middle way approach? Alex, I think it's easy to say no. I don't think the middle way would work anytime other than when there's a vast national consensus. And that was true in the 50s. You had the Democrats and the Republicans. Again, I could have run as a Democrat or a Republican. No one even knew what he was. That's how close the parties were. But, and look, so what caused that? Well, what caused that was the great consensus that had to be forged out of the Great Depression and out of World War II more than anything else about who America was, how America had to work. We haven't had that kind of synthesizing experience over the last several decades. We've had the polarization in which the two parties now they don't even share the same facts. So the middle way doesn't exist. When you're looking at a debate over, say, the LGBTQ issues, when you have the activists, in that movement, who explicitly dismiss any possibility of a middle way, and when you're down to matters of right and wrong, I mean, are you going to allow biological boys to use the girls' room or the locker room in the school? What's the middle way there? It's very, very difficult, and that's true in economics, taxation. You go down the list. That's one of the reasons why the Senate is an entirely different forum than it was just a matter of 20 or 30 years ago. Wayne, why have we not had a general as president since Eisenhower? What happened or changed? Well, some generals have run since Eisenhower was in office, but it's a very, very difficult thing. For one thing, what it takes to be a candidate for president now is very different. Now, in American history, generals, well, we had a general as our first president. Fast forward to the period after the Civil War, almost all the presidents in a row for a long time were Union Army generals. That's just the way it was. That's how they'd emerged in leadership. That's how they had emerged in command. But when you go to the period after, say, World War I, you're really not looking at generals. And the only general you really had as president after that period was Dwight Eisenhower. Remember, MacArthur thought he was presidential material, but he was frankly humiliated in the Republican primaries in 1948. So it's really that Eisenhower is the singular distinctive as a general who has served as president. And look, it's because even just think of Eisenhower's command title, Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces in the European Theater. He had a prominence. I mean, just think of the necessary news coverage of World War II. Eisenhower is out there all the time. Eisenhower was a fixture in the American mind in a way that it's almost impossible for any general to be. And again, the leadership structure, here's another key issue. The leadership structure in America was a much more conscribed, smaller elite during that period. No, everyone could know everybody. And out of that, people could emerge as leaders by consensus. And remember that Eisenhower really didn't have to win the primaries to become the Republican nominee. The Republican grandees, as they were called, the leaders of the Republican Party, basically said, we want you to be our presidential nominee. There was more to it than that, but it was all basically the Republican leadership coming to Eisenhower saying, you're the man. That's just not going to happen again. It's not just the military that's changed, it's the entire political process and presidential elections that have changed. Dwight from Missouri, how do we reconcile Dwight David Eisenhower's moral failings and the handling of his wife's issues and difficulties when he was in the military and as president? Dwight, that was a hard issue for me to know how to address and how directly to address, because it's just absolutely true that during the time that Ike was serving as Supreme Commander, he had an entirely inappropriate relationship with an aide by the name of Kay Summersby. And there is evidence that at one point he considered leaving Mamie, his wife, whom he married in 1916, and marrying Kay. But that would have been impossible for him to maintain leadership credibility. And George Marshall, we're told, at least in some of the historical record, told Eisenhower that if he did such a thing, he would see to it that Eisenhower was no longer in influence and authority. I don't know if that exchange ever took place. I don't know if there was adultery in the classic sense, but I do know there was every appearance of it, and Eisenhower bears full responsibility for a relationship that never should have happened. And then you talk about his wife's issues and difficulties. She was resentful, jealous, we understand that, and look, she spent lots of time with Ike distant from her, and they largely communicated by letter. Eisenhower seems to have taken action to try to remedy that situation shortly after winning the victory, bringing Mamie with him to Europe, ending their relationship with Kay Summersby. But Dwight, and so I have to put Eisenhower in a different class in this sense than someone like JFK, John F. Kennedy, who we now know had more adulterous and premarital affairs than I can count, including when he was in the White House and all the rest. This is not on the same scale, but as a Christian I have to say this was definitely sin and needs to be addressed as such. And it has to be a blight on Eisenhower's life. I'm thankful it was not a lifelong pattern. There's no evidence it was a lifelong pattern, either before World War II or after, and certainly not in the White House. So, the fact we're having this discussion is an indication of the legacy of sin. I'm not even sure what exact sin it was, except it was certainly a sin against his marriage and a sin against his own reputation. And so here we are talking about Dwight Eisenhower as leader, and there it is. But here's something else. Dwight, thinking about this, it'd be impossible to beat JFK in the White House today. In the age of social media and with different rules by the media reporters covered for John F. Kennedy and his adultery, sneaking women into the White House at night. That wouldn't happen today. The coverage would be there. And so it would be a different thing entirely. Douglas from Charlotte, where would I rank Eisenhower among presidents? This is where, and you may remember that Bill Clinton, who I would not rank very high, Bill Clinton complained, he said, there never was a great crisis so that I could be a great president. A little bit of narcissism in that probably, but there's a sense in which what he said was true. I mean, if Eisenhower had not lived the life he did, and if the 50s had not been as strategic as they were, and if the Cold War hadn't been the threat that it was, then maybe we wouldn't be talking about Eisenhower as a great leader. But the fact is, all those things came at one moment. And again, to me, it's just, as a Christian, I have to look at history with a providential understanding. In God's providence, Ike didn't leave frustrated the Army after 16 years as a major. He was the right man at the right time. He was there. In retrospect, you can connect all the dots and say that's what made Ike Ike. There's a sense in which you have to look at American presidents and say it takes great leadership at a greatly momentous time. And because I think in retrospect the 50s were so crucial, I'd put Eisenhower, and because look, I go back to the fact that there's so few successful presidents who serve 2 terms and are as popular leaving as they were coming in. That's just an amazing thing. So he has to rank in political skill and in historical significance, certainly in the top 10 of American presidents. But when I do that, I just want to say, Douglas, that doesn't mean he's my favorite in my top 10 favorites. Because I think, if we're honest, we're looking at figures from history, There are reasons of personality and interest that may make us, feel a little even closer to certain people than to others. One of the problems with Ike is he's a pretty remote figure. Like I say, it's to me as a leader, it's one of the greatest quandaries of leadership. How can you so dominate a period that you did so when no one noticed it until a generation later? That's something. So thank you for the question. John, last question today. How does one prepare to be ready to show virtues when they're called upon? Ike seemed to have the virtues necessary at the moments that were needed. What does one do to prepare for those moments? Well, what a great question, John, but I just have to assume this. Eisenhower was courageous when no one knew it, and no one had opportunity to see it. Eisenhower had the virtues of honesty long before you had someone like Douglas MacArthur or Franklin Roosevelt or Winston Churchill or George Marshall who had to take him at his word and when the history is hanging in the balance. But it showed up. I have to believe that having those Bible readings in the morning and in the evening in that home when he was growing up was one of 7 boys had to have some impact on him. And this is where we as Christians understand that the virtues don't come out of a vacuum. They come out of moral formation. And that's what the church is about. We call it discipleship. It comes by the ordinary means of grace and the preaching of the Word of God. But none of us knows how courageous we are until we have to be, if we're honest. I think we're all courageous in our imagination. The difference is, are we courageous at the moment? Virtues of honesty, they have to be pre-commitments. But we need to be honest. We got to pray that in ourselves, as in others, the virtues will show up at just the right time, in just the right measure. What an honor to think with you today about the life and legacy of Dwight Eisenhower. The whole point in leaders thinking about leaders is what Fox Connor taught Ike, and that is you learn it from others in order to hopefully see the right leadership in yourself and in those you influence. Maybe so for all of us. God bless you. Thank you again for joining us for this leadership briefing.
As promised, I'm back and I have gifts to give to you. Some of you may not be aware that Dr. Mohler produces a daily podcast called The Briefing. I can say with all confidence, you will not find a better resource than The Briefing to provide you with a biblical perspective on the important issues and events of the day. All that you have to do to receive your complimentary subscription is to either go to albertmohler.com, fill out a very simple registration, a leadership book that Dr. Mohler has personally selected. The book we're going to be mailing to you is 3 Days in January by Brett Baer. It's a book that you're going to be proud to add to your personal collection. And now, before we go, I want to thank you once more for your attendance today. We hope you enjoyed the program. We hope you'll enjoy the book you're about to receive. And most of all, we hope we get to see you at the next leadership briefing. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.